So, what are those terrorists in Pardubice, Russians and maybe Palestinians up to again? Suspicion of a Russian connection is growing. The Torched Arms factory supplies drones to the Ukrainians. Gentlemen, I think there's a strange feeling in our society that the Palestinian terrorist group and the Russian terrorist group are somehow fundamentally opposed to each other. Like the leftists support Palestine, while the far right supports the Russians, so it can't really go together. But I think this is a fundamental mistake, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So if you want to know more, give a like, write a comment, share this video, of course join the streams, but most importantly, keep watching, because we're starting to get more information that the terrorist attack or possible terrorist attack on LPP was carried out by people who are somehow connected to Russia. The suspicions are here because the organization that was supposed to be behind it, Airquade faction, is, let's say, not very well known, and at the same time it's an organization that doesn't have any significant history and isn't really long-standing. Ovshem, however, in a similar situation, when a local company cooperated with the same Israeli company that LPP worked with, attacks by pro-Palestinian activists or terrorists were carried out in other European Union countries as well. In Germany and in Britain, you get the idea, even though Britain isn't in the European Union. At the moment when companies in Europe, arms manufacturers in Europe, cooperated with Israeli arms manufacturers, they were often subjected to some attacks. The attacks were, of course, attributed to pro-Palestinian radicals. However, when someone says that the attack was carried out by a pro-Palestinian radical or terrorist, it doesn't mean that the Russians are off the hook, that the blame falls on the left, which protests in the name of Palestine, or that it's the work of people who are, for example, pro-Western, but fanatically pro-Western and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender and all these things. It seems to me that things are being connected here that often don't necessarily have to be, because Russia is, of course, quite a big friend of Iran, and Iran is quite a big friend of Palestine, and by extension, Hamas. Therefore, when there is an arson attack, a terrorist attack, or significant vandalism at an arms factory in Europe that cooperates with Israel, and the trail leads to pro-Palestinian supporters at the same time, it's very likely that the trail also leads to Russia. Because Russia will, of course, use hatred towards Israel or sympathy for Palestine or the overall situation happening with Palestine to carry out attacks in Europe, on arms factories in Europe that may have something to do with Israel, which is the pro-Palestinian motive. But effectively, they might also be supplying weapons to Ukrainians, and that's the Russian motive. And here it's important to say that just because someone here supports Palestine, it doesn't mean that they also support these terrorist attacks. At the same time, there is quite a strong connection here to the pro-Russian scene, like Kateryna Konechna and the people around her, who support Iran, support Palestine, condemn Israel, and all these things. You simply can't make that easy shortcut, like, oh, they attacked a pro-Israeli company, so they must be Palestinians or Iranians, because it could just as easily be the Russians. At the same time, you can't take that kind of shortcut, like, well, they're for Palestine because they criticize Israel about Gaza and those things, so they're probably supporters of Palestine, so they're actually connected to the Russians. The connections are much more complicated and can be combined in different ways. It's really not necessary for someone who supports Israel to also support Ukraine, or for someone who supports Russia to also support Iran. There are people who support Russia and at the same time support Israel, and there are people who support Palestine and at the same time support Russia. There are people who support Ukraine and at the same time support Iran, and there are people who support Ukraine and at the same time support Israel. These people are mostly realists, political, and they're not complete lunatics. This is the last group. If you're on the side of Ukraine and also Israel, you're probably not completely crazy. Anyway, the point is that these connections are different. But at the same time, it's important to realize that people will often make these simple shortcuts. So when I was talking about how some pro-Palestinian terrorist group set this building on fire, and I criticized that they did absolutely nothing for Palestine and actually made everything worse, of course that's true, right? Because even if their motives were state terrorism, because their motivation wasn't to go against Israel or anything like that, but they were paid by Russia and blah, 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 in reality it makes Palestine's position in the Czech Republic worse. Because people will associate the fact that it was done by some pro-Palestinian activists and the fact that it leads to Russia, that's obviously something that's connected to it. Because we know that a lot of these pro-Palestinian idiots have connections to Russia and others don't and are just idealists. It's all just terribly tangled and complicated, and people will inevitably create some kind of shortcut. Either people make a shortcut in their heads that if you support Palestine, ergo you're pro-Hamas, ergo you're a terrorist, ergo you're far left, or they make a shortcut that you're with Iran, so you're against Ukraine. Simply put, people are idiots. Okay, people are idiots, they'll keep making shortcuts. The very fact that it was funded by Russia doesn't matter, because people will still be toxic towards Palestine. Because it was a pro-Palestinian group funded by Russia, so the crime is kind of complete. If someone here used hate against Palestine to carry out an attack that benefits Russia, then that was pretty clever. Because basically, he took a nation, let's say, that's quite unpopular in the Czech Republic, in its name carried out an attack, and that attack suits the Russians, right? So simply put, it was, or it could be, quite a tactical move. Because instead of the Russians doing it themselves, right, Russia damaged its own fairly solid position here, which luckily is weak, but not the worst. So they did it through a Palestinian puppet. And by doing that, they damaged the Palestinian position here, which practically doesn't exist anyway, right? Yeah, that's true, that happened. But that doesn't mean those pro-Palestinian activists aren't pro-Palestinian activists, because a pro-Palestinian activist can simply be a Russian agent too. Because the world is complicated, and you can't just put people into one box. People have different inclinations toward different situations. For example, I'm clearly on the side of Ukraine, and in the Iranian conflict, I'm clearly on the side of the West. But it pisses me off how stupid Donald Trump is, so sometimes it might look like I'm on the side of Iran. But I'm not on the side of Iran, I'm on the side of the right solutions. And at that moment, I can't be on the side of the United States, because their solution is retarded. That's all. So this whole situation is too complicated to be solved by some shortcut. But what I said about it leading to some effect on the Palestinian perception in the Czech Republic and so on still stands. Simply put, Palestine is finished here. And those who did this have sabotaged it to the maximum. Maybe it was simply the sacrifice of Russia's ally, Palestine, in our territory so that the Russians could harm our arms factory at its expense. That's possible. And quite possibly even likely. So that's that.